from Stripe to Chip, Preparing for EMV Migration webinar. It is hosted by Payment Week, and it is sponsored by Verifi. Verifi is a leading provider of global electronic payment and risk management solutions for card-not-present merchants. Verifi works with merchants, acquirers, and issuing banks to enhance the capabilities of the payment ecosystem with intelligent, innovative, integrated, and inspired payment management services. I am now going to pass it along to Jason Oxman, CEO of ETA, who is going to be moderating this webinar. Jason?
Well, thank you so much, and our thanks to Verifi for helping make this terrific discussion possible. I'm Jason Oxman. I'm the CEO of the Electronic Transactions Association. ETA is the trade association of the payments industry. We represent more than 500 companies across the payments organization based in Washington, D.C., and our members include the entire payments structure from card networks and financial institutions to equipment manufacturers, tech companies doing payments, processors, ISOs, acquirers, everybody in the ecosystem. And we're all very excited about the EMV migration and excited to have the opportunity to have a great discussion today about what the EMV migration means for merchants and consumers, what the benefits of EMV are, how the migration is going, and perhaps most importantly, some thoughts on what we all need to be doing, work together to make this migration successful. I'm joined today by Jeremy Waxman, who is the VP of Product Development at Verifi, and Lori Breitzke, who is Marketing Manager at VeriFone, and I'll provide more information and introduction to them shortly. But let's just set the stage for our discussion over the course of this conversation. The agenda of the webinar, quite simply, is to look at an overview of EMV and its benefit over the current payments architecture that's deployed here in the US, how EMV fits in with other security measures that are being implemented by payments companies, what efforts are being made by the industry to introduce the concept of EMV and the behavioral changes and the benefits of EMV. What kind of security issues can EMV address, and what does it not address? And we'll talk about how the industry is adapting to the current environment and the constant threats that we face from security breaches. We will, of course, reserve plenty of time at the end of this webinar, or prior to the end of this webinar, for your questions, because we have great industry experts with us here to talk about the importance of this issue. So, setting the stage, what is EMV? EMV, at its simplest, is an acronym for EuroPay, MasterCard, Visa. It's a chip. It's enabled, embedded in plastic credit cards. EMV is not a new technology. It's been around for a long time, and it is not a technology that brings with it a capability that's never been deployed before. Although 99% of US consumers are not aware of EMV and have never seen a chip in their card, the experience of consumers outside of the US is quite different. The US, in fact, is probably the last major marketplace in the world to migrate to EMV cards. The reason for that is quite simple. We have a robustly competitive infrastructure in the payments industry in the United States. There are more than 10,000 financial institutions that issue credit cards in the US, and there are more than 8 million merchants that accept credit cards in the US. And that infrastructure has grown up quite robustly and quite well over the course of the last 40 years. The infrastructure has been built to support magnetic stripe cards. The credit cards and debit cards we're all familiar with and have the magnetic stripe on the back. That technology is also 40 years old. It's the same technology used in cassette tapes, believe it or not. That's how old it is. And so in order to effectuate the migration to a brand new card technology in the US, it requires infrastructure changes on the two sides of the payments industry. On the issuing side, the 1.2 billion debit and credit cards that US consumers carry around in their wallets all have to be replaced with cards that have chips in them. And of course, on the infrastructure side, the 8 million merchants in the US that accept debit and credit cards have to upgrade their infrastructure in order to accept chip cards, because the reader that reads a chip card is a different technology than the reader that reads a mag stripe card. And therefore, those upgrades have to take place. And then, of course, there's a great deal of education to do, both on the consumer side and the merchant side. Consumers are used to swiping their cards and putting them back in their wallets. They're not used to chip acceptance, which requires inserting a card into a terminal and leaving it there while the card is validated. So the behavioral changes, the infrastructure changes, are all going to play out over the course of the next year. Let's take a look at the EMV migration pathway in the US. Now again, the EMV technology is not new, but the migration to EMV in the US is new. The first migration period that took place was for the payments industry, for the acquiring side of the industry, which had to upgrade its networks and systems in order to process payments initiated by chip-enabled cards, and also the system for validating chip cards with issuers. That deadline for the payments industry acquiring side was April of 2013. So all processors, ISOs, acquirers, and payment networks have upgraded their infrastructure. The next important date is October of 2015, which is the deadline for merchants to upgrade their terminals to avoid the potential for fraud liability. Now, what does that mean? In the first instance, where there's credit card fraud, issuers take liability for it today. So all the breaches we hear about, the production of counterfeit cards, issuers take fraud liability. Now there is a mechanism for recovery from merchants if the merchant is found at fault, for example, but in the first instance the fraud is always the responsibility of the issuer. Starting in October of 2015, that system is going to change such that responsibility for fraud will lie with the party to the transaction that has deployed the lesser form of security. And I'll give two examples. One, in a case where a merchant has deployed an EMV-capable terminal, but an issuer has not issued an EMV card, in a fraudulent transaction, the issuer would have responsibility because the issuer, by failing to deploy EMV cards, has deployed the lesser form of security. If, however, an issuer has deployed EMV cards, but the merchant has not upgraded the terminal to EMV capability, in the case of a fraudulent transaction, the merchant will have responsibility. In other words, whichever party has deployed the lesser form of security will have liability. This is meant to provide an incentive to both issuers and merchants to upgrade their infrastructure capabilities for EMV. Now, there are some exceptions to this October 2015 date for companies that are deemed to have a more robust challenge in implementation. For example, you can imagine fuel dispensers where the terminal is built into the fuel dispensing unit. That's a difficult change. ATM machines, where those machines have integrated card readers such that the whole machine would have to be replaced, also a challenge. So some industry segments have until October of 2017 for that fraud liability shift. Now, one of the most interesting things about EMV is, as I mentioned before, the challenge of education. Consumers are starting to see their cards show up in the mail when their replacement cycle runs with chips in them. And they're starting to see merchants that have deployed EMV, although not all of them have turned them on yet. Because of the challenge of the payments environment here in the US, it is definitely the case that the infrastructure upgrades on both sides will take some time. So we expect that by the end of 2015, about half of the nation's terminals and about half of the nation's issued cards will be EMV capable. Again, it takes a very long time to replace a 40-year-old infrastructure. That's obviously not where we'd like to be by the time the infrastructure upgrade is complete. We want to be at 100%. But keep in mind, a lot of these merchants are very small merchants that may not want to make the investment in infrastructure. There's no regulatory or legal mandate to do so. And a lot of issuers will have to reach their cardholders and replace their cards. And that's going to take some time as well. But the industry is very excited about the upgrade. We are devoted to it. And although there's a lot of work to do, we will get there soon. And there are some positive signs. For example, last Friday, the President signed the Buy Secure initiative, The significance of the Buy Secure initiative was the government, the federal government, will now issue benefits cards as EMV cards and will also accept EMV cards as a retailer at government facilities like national parks and cafeterias in government buildings and the like. So the government's embracing of EMV is an important step and will help educate consumers about the importance of the transition. There's me, who I've already introduced myself, and ETA. Hopefully you're all familiar with ETA and the organization. Look forward to working with many of you on this call as we move the EMV migration forward. Let me now introduce the two panelists who will be joining me for some discussion of some of these issues. They are industry experts and are best positioned to provide further detail and color around the opportunities and challenges presented by EMV. Jeremy Waxman is VP of Product Development at Verifi. Jeremy has been with Verifi since 2012 and has extensive product management and product marketing experience in the payments industry. And Lori Breitzke is the marketing manager at VeriFone. VeriFone, everyone's familiar with, the largest payment terminal manufacturer in the US. She's been in the payments industry for more than 20 years and really brings an incredible depth of knowledge about these issues. So let's talk about EMV and holders involved. And Lori, I want to ask you this first. Can you talk to us a little bit about who is involved in the transition to EMV? What companies, not the specific companies because there are obviously a lot, but what industry categories are involved in making EMV happen, and how are they each addressing the need to make this migration to EMV work?
Sure. Thanks. Hello, Jason and me and everyone on the phone today. Again, we appreciate being able to participate in the webinar today. Certainly, I think EMV, as Jason said, it's been all over the world. I think it's deployed in over 120 countries worldwide. So again, not new, but of course very new to us. And with our, I think, over 6,000 financial institutions, certainly they're one of the key stakeholders. As you said, the issuer kind of has this migration for us, and we've seen some rather large financial institutions begin to employ EMV and distribute those cards. Hopefully when you guys in your wallet, you'll start to see those chips on your cards. Some of them mostly seem to be doing this upon an expiration date. So when you look in your wallet, look at that expiration date, and you should be getting an EMV card the next time you get that card in the mail upon expiration. Or of course, we have VeriFone and the other terminal manufacturers that provide those terminals and help the merchants integrate. And of course, that's very complicated, and it's not as easy as it sounds. And another really key stakeholder are the merchant acquirers, who you mentioned had to comply by April of 2013. And so that was obviously important for them to get that connectivity as the first step in order to process and send those EMV transactions. And Visa, MasterCard have been ready. They've been deployed, within all their other countries. So, of course, they probably had some tweaks that they wanted to do within the United States, and they had to go and make those changes as well. So I'm sure everyone on the phone has been impacted by EMV, hence why you're listening to us today. So I think the stakeholders in EMV, it's huge, right? So everyone is really is impacted. We're all looking at not only the executive order you mentioned, which is really important, but also just the October of 2015 date next year.
Thanks, Lori. And Jeremy, let me turn to you for your assessment of how we're doing here in the U.S. and how the EMV migration is going, and what you're hearing from your customers here in the U.S. about the importance of EMV, about the costs of the EMV upgrade. What kind of feedback are you getting about how we're doing as an industry in preparing for this?
Hey, first let me thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. EMV is a very hot topic overall with merchants, not just in the retail point of sale space, but also in the card not present space. The concern with our merchants is the impact will be positive and beneficial on the retail side of the card present space. But if you look at trends over time for countries that have launched or deployed the EMV solution, the trends tend to push the fraudulent activity to the card not present space. So our merchants are primarily very happy and eager to see the protection on the card present space, but there's a growing concern of what will happen to the card not present space.
And Jeremy, let me stay with you because I think that's a very important point. We hear about the importance of EMV, particularly in the context of the retailer breaches that have garnered headlines in recent months. And obviously, EMV itself would not have stopped those retail breaches, but it would have made it harder for criminals to produce counterfeit cards because the mag stripe is easy to counterfeit. The EMV chip is not possible to counterfeit because it generates a unique security code with each transaction. So as you alluded to, Jeremy, we see the experience outside of the U.S. Fraud migrates from the card present environment to the card not present environment. If we're anticipating that happening here, Jeremy, can you talk a little bit about what goes along with EMV? What else do we need to be talking about in order to ensure that we don't see this huge increase in fraud online as we migrate to EMV here?
Absolutely. So as this is a blessing and a curse in the omni-channel merchant space, we've seen that a lot of merchants internationally, when this was deployed, started to deploy things like 3D Secure, verified by Visa, MasterCard Secure Code, which shifts liability and also covers you somewhat on the fraudulent activity. However, in the past, that was seen in the U.S. and hasn't been adopted in the U.S. due to the impact and usability. Pop-ups, having to enter another password, it's just not common or adopted in the U.S. However, providers have started to create enhancements to allow merchant control and rules on when that will be enabled to mitigate the usability impact. From an overall fraud and risk perspective, our merchants are really concerned, or they're really looking for layered protection, where they can manage and leverage different providers for different instances, whether that be 3D Secure, device intelligence, IP intelligence, and really make an informed decision and try to prevent the fraudulent activity. But there's also that fine balance between preventing fraud and preventing way too many good transactions. We've seen numbers as high as 40-to-1 with false positives. So it's important to dial back and have pre-sale and post-sale protection, something that will manage and prevent fraud on the front end, like 3D Secure, device intelligence, IP intelligence, even doing a KYC, know your customer validation for high-value transactions. And then having post-sale dispute resolution, so to speak, with things like the Verifi cardholder dispute resolution network, which can help balance the prevention and response to chargebacks or disputes. And that's very important to remember because card not present fraud is expected to more than double by 2018. So we're going to continue to see that grow, and then the impact of EMV on the card not present space, it's just going to get bigger and bigger. So you need to have a layered approach on both pre-sale and post-sale.
So I've got a couple.
Lori, let's talk.
Oh, sorry. A couple things on that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, there's the EMV migration forums has a number of work groups positioned towards this, because I totally agree with Jeremy there that the fraud is going to escalate, and we've certainly seen that happen in the UK and in Canada and other countries where that's certainly what's happened. I mean, the fraudsters are going to find that hole, and of course, CMP not having that EMV cryptography will certainly be where they're going to go. And then there's also a couple things. Both Visa and MasterCard have announced their digital service, and I think it'll be interesting to see who at a merchant level, especially those larger e-commerce merchants, certainly some airlines, and there's a number of other very large e-commerce merchants that are getting ready to employ this technology. So it'll be interesting to see how this impacts just the way their life is, and whether it does help with, which it should, help with that type of fraud that is coming there. But I also want everyone on the phone to know there's certainly a lot of really smart people that are focusing on this issue, realizing that it's certainly going to become a problem.
What are we hearing from merchants when they are told that they have to upgrade to EMV? What are their responses based on expense and perceived benefit to them? And also, can you address as part of that, obviously they're concerned about the cost, but how does the advent of mobile payments and Apple Pay and NFC acceptance capability, how does that fit into the conversation that is going on with 8 million merchants about the desirability and the benefits of upgrading to EMV capability?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly at this point, what we hear from merchants depends on their size. So if those merchants are larger merchants, you know, in your tier 1, tier 2 space, then they certainly see the benefit of not having that card present counterfeit fraud liability. So they certainly understand that. For them to, it's more expensive proposition for them to, of course, upgrade their infrastructure, but clearly they can look at that line item and say, okay, that fraud looks like this, and I can save this money and I won't be liable for that, and so that's a good thing. But where we see a big struggle is certainly in the SMB market, in the small merchant space. Certainly if you're a dry cleaners and you know everybody that comes in, it's unlikely that a stranger is going to come in and give you their clothes and then commit fraud against you. So you're really not, that merchant is really struggling with, why would I want to pay more and what's the benefit to me? They really aren't getting it. They don't. That whole ISO space that Jason, you and I live in every day is certainly struggling a little bit with, how do I do that? How do I convince the merchant that it's worth it? Because it's worth it for them. It's worth it for the ISO and for the acquirer to definitely upgrade that merchant, because that liability is going to fall on them if that merchant fails for some reason. So it's definitely worth it for them. But, you know, merchants don't want to change what they have today. They're very happy if it's working. They're very happy that's, you know, payment is really a necessary evil. They just have to be able to get paid, but they really want to focus on their goods and services. So that channel has definitely been a challenge to get them to upgrade. I would say with mobile and, of course, with Apple Pay, we've certainly seen mixed results in the news recently, where some larger merchants have chosen to turn off Apple Pay. I think that with any new and broad announcement like this, you know, we're going to see some people that are going to jump on the bandwagon and some that aren't. You know, with NFC and a contactless device being part of EMV, I think it was very smart of Apple to leverage that infrastructure upgrade that will happen. Certainly for the larger merchants, it'll happen by next year, by October 2015. You know, for the smaller ones, it may be somewhat slower. But we've seen, for those merchants that have or have it employed and are seeing transactions, it's certainly working okay. I don't think that the consumers have necessarily adopted Apple Pay yet. It'll probably take a little while for that to take hold, just like any new payment technology does.
So Jeremy, let's talk about the place of EMV among other security initiatives. One of the security standards we hear most about is PCI, which is a standard that's been developed over the course of the last decade to help merchants, both online and offline, secure their infrastructure to make sure that they are not vulnerable to outside hackers. We hear about PCI in the context of brick and mortar retail breaches, the big ones like Target and Home Depot, and EMV, obviously, as we discussed before, has a place in making it harder to create counterfeit cards. But can you talk to us a little bit more about where we're going with PCI compliance? Does the advent of EMV change the needs of PCI? Is PCI positioned well to address the offline environment that you're most familiar with, the card not present environment, as well as the online environment? Talk to us about how PCI fits in with this transition.
Obviously, the PCI is very important today, and it evolves over time. The PCI 3.0 is scheduled to launch in the future. And they have evolved the rules and regulations, and there's very smart payments professionals that help protect the importance and the value of personal card information. When we talk about PCI compliance, the majority of folks we talk to don't want to have to worry about PCI compliance from a merchant perspective, so they look towards tokenization solutions for the most part to lessen the impact of PCI compliance on them, where solutions like the ability to enter card information on a merchant's website actually does not get entered on the website and is never actually touched by the merchant, and that information is sent to what a lot of people call a secure vault or a payments vault. There are providers out there, including Verifi, that provide that vault information or that vault capability, and it lessens your need and your requirements from a PCI perspective. Combining that with some of the areas of risk and fraud prevention, like I mentioned before, things like device intelligence, IP intelligence, KYC, a lot of discussion around biometrics and geolocation from a Wi-Fi to a mobile location perspective. All of these factors can come into play, and I keep using that word layered because it's important to use and leverage multiple providers at one time. The reason is that technology changes, and as we all know, integrating into each one of these providers can be somewhat expensive, especially if they're new and innovative, like biometrics. The iPhone uses a fingerprint. We have facial recognition providers that allow to authenticate that way, or keystroke calculations. How fast do you type between the D and the E when you're typing Dear John, so to speak? So it's important that will not prevent breaches from an overall perspective, but by using and leveraging a company like Verifi that is focused and experts in the payment card storage and PII information storage space, you're greatly lessening your risk having or being impacted by a breach in the future.
Lori, nobody wants to be breached, and obviously merchants suffer not only financial harm but also reputational harm with a breach. But of course, merchants are sensitive to costs associated with infrastructure investment. Can you talk to us about what it costs a merchant to upgrade to EMV capability? Obviously, VeriFone has a lot of great products on the market and is the market leader here in the U.S., and there are other providers as well. But can you give us an idea of what kind of cost we're talking about for, particularly for the small businesses that you were talking about that might be hesitant to make this kind of infrastructure? And as part of that, can you also tell us whether there is any incremental cost with the NFC capabilities going along with EMV? In other words, the ability to accept not only the new chip cards, but also accept contactless payments from a mobile device as well. What kind of economic impact are we talking about on businesses that are looking to upgrade their infrastructure?
Yeah, sure. So a couple important points too is that EMV is not the PAN is still sent, which is the primary account number, is still sent in the clear in those transactions. So it is a PCI recommendation and a VeriFone recommendation. I'm sure a Verifi as well. That there is some kind of encryption that is done immediately at the point of sale. As well as employing tokenization, and we're seeing all major large merchants move to this, as well as pretty much all the acquirers have this employed. So it's something that comes automatic in a VeriFone terminal, and we ask that everyone, you have to enable it, you have to turn it on, and so we strongly suggest that everyone employ tokenization and some kind of encryption. We offer a number of solutions there. So those are definitely have costs associated with them. As Jeremy mentioned, there's a host security module kind of like that, which is called TSM, which kind of has that token secure. That costs money to do that. So if you're a large retailer, you certainly have those costs. You have to upgrade your terminals. So if you are within, you have multiple lanes, of course. Per lane, you would need to update each terminal, as well as your infrastructure. So if you're on some old telecommunications infrastructure, you're probably already upgraded to IP or something else, and then you would want to continue with that or make sure that you've got faster speed there, because EMV is going to require some more frequent updates to the software. As well as the packets, are a little bit bigger than what we see in MagStripe. So those per device costs, at this point, for a VeriFone terminal, it's not tremendously more to have EMV and NFC built in. Being a worldwide provider, those costs are kind of, amortized over so many thousands, millions of devices that it's not like it was, 2 years ago. We pretty much don't ship. I think we say like 80% of our terminals are EMV enabled. We have one device that is not, and then you attach an EMV enabled pin pad to it. So it's certainly an option. We also highly recommend some kind of consumer facing device because the transaction flow is going to be a little bit different with EMV. So certainly with the costs, comes time, of course, and probably some staffing requirements. It's something new, so you're going to have some training so that people understand it. Certainly the clerk training, but also any type of IT infrastructure training. So NFC to do the EMV band or EMV incentives really say that it needs to be a contact and contactless. Integrated together, what they're calling a hybrid device. In order to receive any of the incentives, the device has to be both. So really the NFC piece is there. You certainly have some additional downloads that may need to be required, but it's not really an incremental cost. It kind of comes with when you do an EMV device. Did I cover everything there, Jason? You asked me a lot of stuff.
You did. Thank you, Lori. Jeremy, Lori mentioned a couple of other security tools that are often discussed as the tripartite approach to security upgrades to infrastructure. We're obviously talking about EMV, but she also mentioned, I want to ask you to help our listeners understand the difference between those different technologies, particularly because, as Lori mentioned, EMV is important for addressing counterfeit cards, but an EMV transaction still generates a PAN, a primary account number that's transmitted over the infrastructure. So, Jeremy, can you walk us through the difference between EMV tokenization and end-to-end encryption, and what in fact we mean when we talk about those different deployments, and also what they mean in a card present and a card not present environment as well. So EMV, tokenization, end-to-end encryption. Jeremy, go.
Well, first, I'd like to build on what Lori was saying with the associated with costs. And you know that the terminal and point of sale is VeriFone's core capabilities. To add on to the additional that merchants may incur, there's a study that was done in 2013 by LexisNexis, the True Cost of Fraud study, that points out that 29% of fraud victims will avoid certain merchants. So that's important to remember when, the decision to integrate EMV or not integrate EMV, or the speed to get EMV up and running, because there's also costs associated with fraud and brand identity, brand image. When it comes to encryption and tokenization, the core function of both is to ensure, like Lori stated, that the card numbers are not able to be intercepted, so to speak, via that secure terminal connection between the entry point of the card information, whether that be a computer or a point of sale terminal, and the processing or vault entity.
Okay. Well, thank you for that overview. Let's talk a little bit more about what's coming in the future. And while we get ready to do that, please take advantage of the chat window on of this webinar, and enter your questions, because I have access to the chat window and can see your questions. I want to make sure all of your questions are addressed by this group of experts before we get off the call. So if you have any questions, you can certainly enter them now, and I will endeavor to make sure that we have time to address all of the questions you have. I know our presenters are very interested in getting your questions answered to make sure this is a valuable undertaking for you as well. So let's talk a little bit about where we're headed. Lori, I want to have you put on your fortune teller cap for a minute and fast forward to 2015 and the EMV implementation date. There are industry statistics that suggest that we'll be about halfway there as far as both issuing and the acquiring side, the merchant side of deployment. Can you give us your future cast prediction of what will look like as we move from 2015 forward? What will we be focused on? Will we see an environment where most of the large merchants, for example, are migrated, but the smaller businesses are not? And will some small businesses just decide not to make the migration change for a long time. How will we be doing with consumers, getting them to understand how chip cards work, educating them about the importance of using their chip cards? Take us to a year from now and look forward into 2016 from the end of 2015. How do you think we'll be doing, and what do you think we'll be focusing on as an industry as part of this migration?
Okay, sure. Okay, so a few things within there. We kind of break things up into a few different categories. And I think that, of course, the merchants or the retailers are one of those categories. I think we'll see all of the major, top 100 merchants will be, well on their way by October, within 1 year. Of being, if not already deployed in all their stores, definitely assigned the developers in that integration, as well as have some pilots and have that intent clearly determined by that time. Now those would be more retail. I think being such a complicated market in the United States, I think restaurant is certainly very up in the air right now as far as will the consumer hand over their card to a server when it has a chip in it, and then is the chip going to be somehow inserted? If there's any prompting, obviously that's going to be an issue. So I think when we talk about the infrastructure that needs to take place, certainly we need to separate out retail from some of the other merchant categories, just because it is going to be quite a bit more complicated to really go down to that restaurant or any type of environment where you're handing over your card is commonplace today in the United States. Internationally, we see portable devices everywhere, and we see them somewhat in the United States today, but of course with EMV, I think that's going to obviously be much more important. So I think we're going to see some large providers talking about some new solutions to that specific market. For the SMB space, I think that we will see. Oh, sorry for the SMB space. I think it'll be somewhat slower. I think it'll be the acquirers and ISOs that will just be replacing devices with EMV NFC devices. Not in all cases is it really going to be that important to a small merchant, as far as they may not even know that they can now read a chip. I think we're somewhat behind on the issuer side, and I see that as being really important for those small merchants, because of course if you never see a chip card, you're not even going to be concerned about it at all. So I don't have those exact statistics in my head, but I definitely think I would be surprised if we were 50% by October of next year. If you talk about the entire infrastructure that needs to be updated. But certainly when you're talking about that retail, large, to mid-tier, I think we'll be well on our way.
Lori, let me stay with you for a second before I ask Jeremy to address what the online environment will look like. We have a question about chip and PIN versus chip and signature. And I think this is a question that comes up quite often when we talk about the EMV migration. Chip and PIN deployments are fairly common outside of the U.S. because, of course, the infrastructure is different outside of the U.S. We've seen a lot of discussion about whether the migration here will be chip and signature or chip and PIN. Lori, can you tell us a little bit about where we are with that discussion and what the rollout will look like here?
Yes, of course. So in the United States, we have chosen to allow the issuer to make that decision as to whether or not it is chip and PIN, chip and signature, or what we call no CVM or no cardholder verification method, which means that it would be just a tap and pay environment. A merchant also is very influential in that decision. As an example, if a merchant decides to not employ PIN within their merchant environment, they can select to do that, and then they would downgrade to the next level of security on that card. Since in the U.S. it's an issuer decision, so far we have seen issuers, all issuers actually, select chip and signature. We have not seen a chip and PIN, and this would be a PIN on your credit card. But that doesn't mean that, especially due to the executive order, it'll be interesting to see if that influences issuers to move to PIN. But we will see that. So it could be somewhat complicated that if a retailer decides to accept all of those forms, then certainly one consumer could have a chip and signature card, and then the next consumer could have a chip and PIN card. So we will see a multitude of implementations here in the state.
Important to note as well that the EMV chip itself is what prevents the card from being counterfeited. The cardholder verification method, the signature versus PIN, addresses lost and stolen fraud, which is a much smaller percentage of fraud in the U.S. The vast majority of fraud is counterfeit fraud, which the chip prevents because it generates a dynamic security code. That lost and stolen, where someone steals the card out of my pocket and tries to use it before I'm able to report it stolen, the PIN would address that much smaller category of fraud. Jeremy, I want to talk to you about, I'm sorry?
Oh, no, I was just agreeing with you.
Jeremy, I want to address a question that has come in about the impact of EMV on CMP merchants. We talked about how EMV obviously doesn't stop fraud. Nobody has a chip card reader in their house while they're shopping online. But, of course, there is a risk of fraud increasing significantly on CMP merchants. So can you respond to a question we have here about how EMV is going to influence the decisions that card-not-present merchants make in 2015 and beyond?
Absolutely, and that's a great question, by the way. And to build on it, basically, there's no silver bullet, right? As we get innovative and look for new ways to prevent fraud, fraudsters are going to find new ways to try and complete fraudulent activity. I mean, perfect example is the fraudulent activity that just happened earlier this week in Brazil, where issuers' cards were used in fraudulent activity and faked to go through as EMV transactions when they actually were not EMV transactions because that issuer hadn't issued cards yet. I believe the term was called a replay attack or something like that. Yeah. But when we look at the overall impact of EMV to the online space, it's important to like we discussed, beef up your fraud protection on the front end by leveraging multiple providers looking to shift the liability by using things like 3D Secure to help protect yourself. On the other side, there's also the need to be aware of the physical conversion risk. So I use my EMV card to buy something online. I go and then pick it up in the store. I'm not using that PIN in the store to authenticate, or maybe I am, depending on the point of sale capabilities of that particular merchant. And maybe Lori can comment on some what I call in-store pickup capabilities. But those are the areas that there's going to be more new forms of fraud across that blur the line between online and offline channels. So it's important to leverage multiple providers, layering approach, trying to shift your liability by incorporating things like 3D Secure to prevent the fraud from occurring.
Lori, let me also ask you to address a related question to what you were discussing earlier about the costs to merchants. We have a question from our audience about the upgrade costs beyond the equipment cost. So if a merchant purchases a new terminal, that obviously has a cost associated with it. But are there other costs for the EMV migration, for the upgrade? Are there other hard costs, as the questioner puts it, that the merchant has that we need to talk to them about as part of the EMV migration?
Yeah, so I think for a small merchant, I mean, today we have not seen the card brands change their interchange rates for EMV. Today it is an incentive where there are some reductions in overall expenses that a merchant would occur, such as PCI and then a liability shift, of what are presently has been announced. So I think that as we see this progress, we certainly may see some changes within interchange for whether or not there is, it will influence the cost of a transaction. So today, the cost of an EMV transaction from an interchange standpoint is the same as a non-EMV. It is only that, of course, it's card present, and then again, in whatever merchant category they would fall into. And then, of course, that happens as well as if they're, cost plus or whatever that merchant specific cost arrangement is for particular transaction fees. Education, I think, is an expense to them, kind of probably a soft expense, depending on the size of the merchant. They're certainly going to have to do some additional training for their clerks. Because there is additional prompting. The transaction flow for an EMV transaction is completely different than for a magstripe transaction. And I'll point out two really key differences. One is that the amount must be entered first. So today we typically, swipe our cards at a larger merchant before the amount is known, or we hand over our cards. The merchant swipes the card and then enters the amount. With EMV, that amount is used in that dynamic CVV that Jason and Jeremy talked about earlier. So that amount must be known and within the terminal before the EMV transaction can be started. So after the amount is entered, then the consumer would insert their card. That card has to be inserted and continue to stay within that device until that transaction is completed. So today we swipe our card, we put it back in our wallet, the transaction continues, all of our items are scanned, and we're good to go and we leave the store. Now we're going to see consumers inserting their card, hopefully not walking out of the store without their card, but probably walking out of the store with their card, without their card. So there's going to be some training that the clerks and, that the merchants are going to have to go through. So, what does the clerk do in that case? Do they run after the person and say, hey, you forgot your card? So there's a whole bunch of things that need to be considered, and us as influencers and providers of products within the market need to be able to help them with that. So those are a couple of things I thought of. Can't think of any more.
Very good. Jeremy, we have just a few minutes left, so I want to view in the card not present environment as Lori did in the card present environment. And I want to make sure to remind everybody, if you have a last question in the few minutes we have, please go ahead and enter it in the Payment Week webinar website that you should all have open. Jeremy, let me ask you the same future prognostication question that I asked Lori. We've seen a lot of deployment of new payment technologies in the mobile space, Apple Pay being an example, but obviously PayPal's been around a while, and Google Wallet are enabling mobile payments in the card not present environment, not just at the point of sale, and further securing online shopping. What's your prognostication as to we get into 2015 and EMV is being deployed at the point of sale. Where are we going to be in the conversation about security deployment in the card not present environment? Are we going to see more solutions like the Apple Pay solution where we're using biometrics to shop online? What are you excited about at in the card not present security environment?
I think we're going to see the technology continue to evolve. If you would have said 3 years ago, I'm going to use my fingerprint on my phone, you would have said, no way, not going to happen. And if you look at many of your laptops that you may be looking on, watching the webinar on right now, you may have a fingerprint scanner on there. So there will be times that that things will evolve, and we're going to have to look into this new and innovative ways to prevent fraudulent activity. The most important thing is be prepared, be nimble, and invest in the areas that are going to get hit hard. Know the tools and know how to leverage them in the most efficient and effective capacity to prevent or mitigate your risk.
Excellent. All right, Jason, I think you might have muted yourself, but I'll just take it over from here. I think that about wraps it up for this webinar. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Jason, thank you so much for moderating this webinar. Lori and Jeremy, thank you for joining us and providing your expertise. Hopefully, we'll see you guys next time in a future webinar. And if you wouldn't mind tagging along, there is a short 5-question survey that will be at the end of this webinar. So once again, thank you to all of our speakers and our moderator, Jason, and have a great day.
Thank you.